Um, so it's a meditation on listening. And so listening is a interesting practice because most of the discourse that we have, most of the talk that we do about meditation is visual, you know. We even say, "Oh, well, watch your breath." So it's a very sort of focused way of thinking about meditation, or look inside, as some people might say, you know. So it's not so much, oh, listen. So what I want to offer us is a chance to listen, which opens us up, brings us not only in but out. Um, in the tradition that this comes from for me, in the Korean Zen tradition, this is a meditation that's associated with Guan Yin, who would be the bodhisattva of compassion. And so the idea of listening, opening us up, not only opens up our senses, but it opens up our heart. So, and then maybe we'll be prepared to hear about John Cage and to hear John Cage. So, if you'd like, you could close your eyes, find yourself in a comfortable posture. If you'd care not to close your eyes, maybe you want to turn away from the screen so it's not a distraction. And just feeling your body sitting here right now, feeling your relationship to gravity. So gravity is holding you. And maybe you could let it do that. And so as you come into the present moment through the senses, through your sense of place, your sense of sitting, maybe it's possible just to open your ears and be touched by what arrives there. So, using that as an anchor to keep you in the present moment. We're not thinking of it as listening practice per se, but rather as being open to sound. So, not identifying the sounds, not getting involved in stories about the sound as much as possible. Just letting sound strike the eardrum and create what it creates in you.
He's taking my hole.
So just noticing how your mind is reacting to what's arriving, and see if it can just arrive, have its life, and move on. And so just checking in to see what the mind is doing. Is it open to sounds? Is it off somewhere? Telling a story, making a judgment, asking a question. Maybe you can just come back to opening up to sound. And if it feels right to you, you could think about opening your eyes. And not to end your practice here, but just to bring the visual field in as well. And then when you're ready, you could look at the screen or come back on the screen if you'd like.
Laura's not in the group. I don't know, she couldn't connect somehow.
Okay. So there was our practice. Lots of opportunities for hearing. And so I wonder how that was for you.
Restful.
Restful. Okay. Other folks? Chris, we unfortunately can't hear you.
Raised by people of all nationalities around the world, with a Chinese pianist, Venezuelan conductor, and an Indian orchestra.
Is everybody else hearing that music in the background?
Yeah.
Oh, was that planned?
No.
Oh, okay.
I'm not even sure of its source, frankly.
Okay. I have so many computer issues. I'm like, I was wondering if it was just me.
I know. Do I have a window open somewhere?
Yeah.
A tab open? Yeah. Oh my goodness. So interesting. All right. So yeah, as I said, questions coming. What was that, Linda?
I thought that was the presenter, his playing the piano. I thought that was him, the person from Germany.
Yeah, in about 1942, maybe.
Yeah, I have a radio on in the next room, and it was playing American in Paris. Excuse me, Rhapsody in Blue. That may be what you heard. I'll go turn it off.
That was
It
what
was
we
actually
heard.
beautiful.
Okay.
I thought it was part of the
Wonderful.
presentation. I was like, oh, I'm listening to this music because it's part of John Cage.
I was actually thinking, gosh, I really
No,
thought
that was a little Gershwin.
more
Yeah.
revolutionary than that. He sounds so traditional.
I'm sorry about that.
No, it actually added to the experience because I
Yeah.
liked it.
No,
I was like,
mean,
oh,
it
okay,
was
this is really good
it
music.
was so nicely broken up and random with other things. So yeah.
Joe is reminding us that it's Gershwin's birthday today.
That's right.
Ah,
Part of,
okay.
yeah.
Maybe I should do a talk on Gershwin and Zen Buddhism.
Yeah, there you go. I'm ready. Lay it on us. Okay.
Well, on WRTI in Philadelphia, they're doing tribute to Gershwin and also the Jewish High Holy Days and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So there's quite an interesting mix on
Yeah.
WRTI today. So
Well,
Yeah.
I'd be willing to bet on one thing. We're
What,
not going to
Gary?
do the same thing for John Cage's birthday.
Which is when?
Yeah, you'd ask me that, wouldn't you? He was born in 1912. I know that.
Okay. So,
He was born in 1912, and he died in 1992. He was 80 years old.
there we go.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you fine. Yes.
Okay, before I wanted to ask, is Laura Aiken there? Did Laura manage to join us? Because she
Don't,
bought a ticket. A friend of mine here in
don't see
Germany bought
Laura.
a ticket,
Oh,
and she's not
okay.
there.
Well, let me send her a link here. Do you have her email address real quick?
No, I don't have her email address. My contact with her is on Messenger.
Ah, can you ask her for her email and I will send it right away?
Well, that means I have to leave
Oh,
the
you're-
group and use my phone for that.
You have to use your phone. Okay. All right.
This is getting complicated.
It is.
Just wait a second. Well, that's because that's the way the world works. Hold on
It
for a
is.
second.
Okay.
Yeah.
The more the merrier.
Um,
See if we can get her in.
oh, it's still working. That's good.
Excuse me.
Ah, I can still hear you. Looks like I don't have that either.
I'm gonna go make a cup of coffee. I'll be right back.
It's a good idea. Oh, here we go.
While we're waiting, I have a question.
Sure.
You were talking about during the meditation listening.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had the experience of really enjoying in meditation listening to silence,
Mm-hmm.
which isn't really silent.
Silence. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's actually even easier for me than listening or attending to breathing or
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and very and amazingly well, it's incredible after spending time in silence like that, then hearing sound. It
Mm-hmm.
just seems so much, well, obviously is so much fresher
Yeah.
and more intense in a sense.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's very nice.
That's-
I hadn't actually read or heard of any meditations specifically addressed to listening or sound. So I
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Yeah. So I would say that in Son, the Korean Zen, there is a tradition of that. There's a tradition in Chinese Zen as well. It's mostly far the greater China that that does that kind of a practice as a formal practice.
I'm back.
You're back.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this is the email address.
Okay, hang on one sec. All right, I'm ready.
Lalapo, Lalapo,
Okay.
and then 55555.
So 5 5s.
Yep.
All right.
At gmail.com.
Okay.
I'm getting really good at this. Oh, this computer crap here. But I mean, talking about John Cage, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is that he was such an important influence and made such radical changes in Western music during his life. But we often forget that he had to make a long journey to get there. He didn't start with that. I'd like to go back a little bit in his life and trace his development. His musical development was parallel to his development as a human being, to his personal development. But already at a very early age, he realized that what he was getting from Sunday school at church was not what he needed, as he put it. And so he started looking around when he was in high school. One of his earliest influences was Gertrude Stein. And he started trying to write papers in high school using the kind of writing techniques that she used. This didn't go over too well. He used to go in the library to prepare for his exams. And instead of reading the material that was dictated by the teacher, he would just go in the library and read whatever came into his hand, whatever he felt like reading, and then take the exam on the basis of that. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. But this was his first attempt at some sort of indeterminacy.
But he can see some of us. Oh.
Question?
Don's got long hair. Did you catch a look at Don from a distance? He's got long gray hair. I don't want her up. I'm gonna head out. I don't want her up. I'm gonna head out to Bethlehem. Okay, you leaving? Yeah. Okay, you feeling better? I took the Tylenol. I feel a little better. Okay, all right.
Everybody needs to mute.
Last time I was perfectly fine. Last time I was perfect.
I can't understand anything.
That's okay. That was crosstalk from an open mic. I took care of it.
Okay. Yeah, I know that. Yeah, sure. From Comedy Central. Anyway, when he was studying it, he talked to his parents. He was studying at Pomona College in California. He was born in Los Angeles in 1912. He studied at Pomona College. And in 1930, he talked his parents into letting him go to Europe. So he went to Europe and the first thing he discovered was Gothic architecture. And instead of going around and visiting all the places in Europe that one usually does, he stayed in Paris and studied Gothic architecture, reading all the books about it in the library that he could get his hands on. And he started to take lessons in architecture. But when the architect who taught him told him that he'd have to commit his life to that to make anything of it, he put it away because he decided that there were too many other things that interested him. So he started looking at modernist painting. He looked at Picasso and Matisse and Klee and all of the others who were hanging in Paris and working in Paris at the time. And he tried his hand at that and was rather discouraged. And then since he had been playing the piano at the age of 8, he started learning piano when he was 8, he decided he would go to the Paris Conservatoire and take some lessons. So he took some piano lessons and some harmony lessons, but more importantly, he came into contact with the new music of Europe, which he hadn't heard before, Stravinsky and Bartók and Hindemith and the others, and including Schoenberg. And he was so fascinated by this that he invented his own mathematical system to compose music. But the results were so terrible that he threw everything away. He got frustrated. He did, however, gain the feeling that music was perhaps the way he needed to go. He wrote, "The effect was to give me the feeling that if other people could do things like that I myself could." So he gained a certain amount of self-assurance. In 1932, he returned to California and began having a series of affairs with men and women. He had when he's in his middle 20s, he had a very complicated private life and a very complicated emotional life. Eventually, he tries to find stability in a marriage to a woman named Xenia. He was married to her for 10 years, but this was not a solution, and he found that out rather quickly. 60 years later, he wrote, "I'm entirely opposed to the emotions. I think of love as an opportunity to become blind, and blind in a bad way." We'll return to this later on. He starts to take composition lessons with a man in LA, and he has contact with Henry Cowell. Henry Cowell was an experimental composer of the time, an important mouthpiece for American avant-garde. He taught classes in Oriental and other non-Western music in New York City and had contacts to the entire avant-garde world. And Cage sent him some of his compositions. Cowell was very interested. And he also told Cowell that he wanted to study with Arnold Schoenberg, who lived in LA. And Cowell suggested he come first to New York and study with a former student of Schoenberg's to prepare himself. And he studied also with Cowell himself. So he moved to New York and got a scholarship to do this from, of all people, Charles Ives. And Cowell and Cage became very, very close friends and influenced each other a great deal. In 1934, he returns to Los Angeles and comes in contact with the work of Wassily Kandinsky and the other Blue Rider painters who are in exile there. And Kandinsky says to him that music and art are one reality, just in different forms. For Kandinsky, the colors in his paintings vibrate the same way sounds do. He also learns about Marcel Duchamp, who was an avant-garde painter and sculptor who came to America in 1917 and brought the ideas of the Dada movement with him. The Dada movement asked questions like, what is art? What is not art? If something is beautiful, is it art? If something is costly, is it art? If something has been worked over for a long time by the artist, is it art? If it's profound, is it art? Duchamp's answer to this are his so-called ready-mades. He walks through junkyards and walks through homes in Paris and New York and finds objects which interest him, takes them home. Sometimes he puts them in a slightly different position than their original use would dictate and signs them. He puts his name on them without doing anything else to them. And the fact that he signs them makes them for him a work of art because the artist has exercised some sort of influence on these objects. This is the first contact that Cage has with a Zen idea without knowing it. The question is, what separates art from life? What's the difference between art and life? And he said over and over again, at most any point, I find correspondence between Duchamp and the Orient. An example of Duchamp's ideas is a urinal he finds in a plumbing shop. An ordinary urinal which hangs on the wall in a men's room. And he buys this urinal, takes it home. He puts it in a different position. He doesn't put it in the position that it hangs on the wall, but he lays it flat on its back and signs it with the name R. Mutt, 1917. R. Mutt is the name of the store where he bought the urinal. And Alfred Stieglitz, who was a prominent photographer and a friend of the avant-garde movement in New York, takes photographs of this urinal laying on its side with all different kinds of lighting and calls it the Buddha of the bathroom. And so the discussion arrives about the Buddha nature of the urinal and the Buddha nature of all existence. This is a new way of looking at art where there's no separation between art and life. Cage also comes in contact with the Italian Futurist movement. These were a group of artists and writers in Italy who felt that the mechanical and industrial so-called progress that had been made in the last 100 years demanded a new kind of art that was based on machines and on noise. He reads Luigi Russolo, The Art of Noise. Russolo is an Italian composer who has the idea of raising ordinary daily noise to material for art, for music, to make music out of the sounds that are around him. And that means anything from a locomotive to a sledgehammer to a tram running down the street or a motor car going by. It's interesting, Cage himself later wrote, if we try to ignore noise, it irritates us. But if we listen to it, it becomes interesting. And for the rest of his life, he's going to be very much in love with noise. He begins to experiment with percussion pieces based on noise. Noise meaning instruments that are not pitched, where you can't recognize any particular pitch. He looks for objects in junkyards, just like his hero Duchamp, which when struck makes some kind of noise, brake drums, all kinds of things. And he makes ensembles out of these instruments and out of traditional percussion instruments. They are still based on fixed rhythmic patterns. And although the sound is made up, we'll listen to an instrument, we'll listen to a piece like this in a minute. But at this point, he's still very much controlling the structure of the piece. It's coming from inside him. At the same time, he's studying with Arnold Schoenberg. He finally gets to study with Schoenberg. Schoenberg was really the leading light in 20th century music. And Cage was absolutely in awe of his knowledge and his musical ability, his ability to work with musical material. He studies harmony and counterpoint and analysis with him. At first, assiduously, like a student with a Zen Roshi or a master. He really sits at Schoenberg's feet and learns everything he can about Schoenberg's 12-tone system of composition. Later, however, his instincts point him more and more in the direction of noise. He tries to explain to Schoenberg that he has no feeling for harmony. He loves noise, but he has no feeling for harmony. Schoenberg says, well, if you want to spend your life as a composer, at some point, this lack of feeling for harmony is going to be a wall that you're going to run into. Cage answers, then I'll spend the rest of my life banging my head against this wall. He said, harmony has nothing to say about noise. But under Schoenberg, he also begins to understand the importance of asking questions which are the basis for all answers. 15 years before he gets in touch with Zen Buddhism. He starts working with dancers in San Francisco and in Seattle as a way to get his music performed. He meets Merce Cunningham, who becomes the most important personal and artistic partner for him in his life. And he meets and here's a lecture from a woman named Nancy Ross, who connects the Dada ideas, which he's already heard, with Zen Buddhism, this plants the first seed, which flowers 10 years later when he reads Suzuki. But it's like he's hearing the idea, but he doesn't know what he's hearing yet. He experiments with the radio and electronic music. He experiments with turntables. He makes pieces where two turntables are playing different pitches at different speeds, and he can control how high the pitch is by changing the tempo of the turntable. There are DJs today who do that, but he was doing it a long time ago. The percussion and noise pieces that he wrote led to the prepared piano. He was asked to write music to a dance, to a choreography called the Bacchanal in 1938. So he sat down and tried to use what he had learned from Schoenberg. He tried to use a Schoenbergian kind of row and system that sounded somehow African. He was looking for some way to make it sound exotic so that it would fit in with this dance. But at some point, he had the very important idea that what he needed to change was not the music, but the instrument. So he began experimenting with turning the piano into a percussion instrument. He took various objects, nuts and bolts, pieces of paper and pieces of rubber, and stuck them between the strings, or laid them on top of the strings inside the instrument. And we're going to listen to a piece now that he wrote called Bacchanal, which was the first piece he wrote for prepared piano. When you listen to it, you will still be able to, although the pitches are unclear, you'll still be able to recognize patterns and melodic patterns and rhythmic patterns that repeat. Can you play that for us, please?
Here we go.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Got
Can't
it.
hear me. Yeah, you can turn it off. Yeah, you can see the music is very, I want to say almost primitive. This was the first piece he wrote in this style. If we listen to a piece that he wrote later on for percussion ensemble, I'd like to listen to a little more of that, called Third Construction. You'll see that the patterns and structures in the piece become a great deal more subtle, and the sounds as well, because he uses all kinds of instruments that we're not used to hearing. Third Construction. Can't hear anything. It's very difficult to hear. This is a shame.
Really?
Yeah, I couldn't hear anything at the end. I could see them moving around. I couldn't hear anything. Well, anyway, that's one of his most important pieces, the third construction, and it's performed very often by percussion ensembles all over the world. At this point, however, he still found himself in personal and creative turmoil. He was in a three-way relationship with his wife and with Merce Cunningham. The three of them were living together. And he faced what Zen Buddhists call the great doubt. He kept asking himself, why should I write music? The traditional reason for writing music, which was communication, was unclear and insufficient. It was insufficient for him. He wanted to find a new reason to make music or to give up. He discovers the gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna was an Indian mystic who lived in the 19th century and who also studied Christianity and Islam, who gathered up Indian and Western thought. It takes him 1 year to read this book, but it has an enormous amount of influence on him. He finds a new purpose of music, which is to sober and quiet the mind, thus rendering it susceptible to divine influences. This is much better for him than communication. He also reads Meister Eckhart, who was a medieval German monk, Christian monk, who has many, many ideas which tie in with Eastern thought. And then he runs into Ananda K. Kumaraswamy, who wrote a book called The Transformation of Nature and Art. Kumaraswamy was an Indian historian who spent a lot of time explaining Indian aesthetic concepts to the West and trying to make it clear to them that essentially there were no differences between the two. He talked about the concept of rasa, which is the thrill that comes from sharing the mood and suddenly understanding the true essence of the artwork. And he explained how the Indian aesthetic has built up a complicated system of emotions. All the emotions are divided up into different categories, and within the categories, there are further subcategories listed. And Cage finds all of this extremely interesting, this Hindu theory of art. And he begins working on the sonatas and interludes for prepared piano, which becomes one of his really major works. And he tries to write them in accordance with what are called the 9 permanent emotions, the last of which, and the highest of which, is shanta, or tranquility. The 9 emotions are the erotic, the comic, the compassionate, the heroic, the furious, the fearful, the odious, and the wondrous. And the highest one again is shanta, which is the tranquil. In the sonatas and interludes, he tries to weld Western form together with these Hindu aesthetics. It's a wonderful piece. It's a very magical piece. It's very often played. The sonatas are tightly structured the way an early sonata like Scarlatti would be. They're not traditional sonata allegro form like you find with Mozart or Beethoven. There are only 2 parts to each sonata. And the interludes are much freer. Yeah, we should listen to that now. Listen to sonata number 2 from Sonatas and Interludes for prepared piano. Let's listen to the whole thing. Okay. Listening to this, compare this piece with the two pieces that you heard before. And although the kind of repeated melodic and rhythmic structures are still there, the whole piece has a somewhat different atmosphere. Anybody want to say something about that? How do you feel about this piece compared with the first two pieces we listened to?
Yeah, they both the Bacchanal and the Sonata sound very Asian to me, both in melodic structure and harmonic structure. And the way he prepped the piano for the Bacchanal, it sounded almost like a koto or a shamisen. And the piano sonata sounded like chimes and gongs, but I still got this feeling of an Asian tonality. I lived in China for a year and I heard an awful lot of Chinese music because I lived among the Chinese. And so it sounds very welcome to my ear. The piece for percussion reminded me of Evelyn Glennie, and I was wondering if she had ever performed any, did he write any solo works for percussion that she might have performed? Evelyn Glennie, the deaf percussionist. Yeah.
Yes, of course. Yeah,
That's
no,
it.
I know.
That's all I had to say.
So no, but that's very good because this is all part of his attempt to move away from the Western tradition and to free his music from what he sees as the constraints of what Europe has forced upon the United States. The thing is, it's also, the music is still constructed out of his own taste, out of his likes and dislikes, and all of the structures of the piece are his decision. But he's trying to, as I said, seeking tranquility out of divine influence. It has a somewhat different quality to it than the two first pieces, which are very much more aggressively part of his ego, aggressively part of his personality. He hasn't quite arrived at Zen, however, yet. In spite of having read Aldous Huxley, Aldous Huxley wrote a book called Perennial Philosophies, where he compared all of the world's most important religions. And after reading it, Cage came to the conclusion that Huxley said all of the religions of the world are the same thing, except they have different flavors. And Cage said that the flavor that tasted the best to him was Zen Buddhism. So he starts looking for information about Zen, starts searching the bookshops of New York City. But he hasn't quite gotten there yet. He's kind of like, he's between these two monks. There are two monks who are wandering through the woods and they come to a stream. And one of the monks is a Hindu monk and the other monk is a Zen Buddhist monk. And when they reach the stream, the Hindu monk walks on top of the water and crosses the stream. And the Zen Buddhist monk says, no, that's not the way we do that. Come back here, I'll show you how to do it. So the Indian comes back and the Japanese monk takes him a little further down the stream to a shallow place. And they wade through the stream to the other side, getting their feet wet. And Cage at this point is still trying to float over the water. He hasn't found a way to completely fuse his art with everyday existence, with the universe. The answer comes when he starts reading a book that somebody puts in his hand from a man named Daisetsu Taitaro Suzuki, who was a Buddhist scholar who wrote an enormous amount and translated an enormous amount and lectured all over Europe and in the United States in an effort to bring Zen ideas to the West. He spent a lot of time in US teaching in New York and at universities across the country. Despite being somewhat controversial, his influence is enormous. Most of, or I'd say a large part of the Zen thought that's practiced in the United States today can be traced back to his influence. Sometime around 1950, Cage gets a hold of his Essays in Zen Buddhism, which had just recently been published in a new translation. And I want to read the first page to you. He opens the book, and this is what he reads. Zen, in its essence, is the art of seeing into the nature of one's own being, and it points the way from bondage to freedom. By making us drink right from the fountain of life, it liberates us from all the yokes under which we finite beings are usually suffering in this world. We can say that Zen liberates all the energies properly and naturally stored in each of us, which are in ordinary circumstances cramped and distorted so that they find no adequate channel for activity. This body of ours is something like an electric battery in which a mysterious power latently lies. When this power is not properly brought into operation, it either grows moldy and withers away, or it is warped and expresses itself abnormally. It is the object of Zen, therefore, to save us from going crazy or being crippled. This is what I mean by freedom, giving free play to all the creative and benevolent impulses inherently lying in our hearts. Generally, we are blind to this fact, that we are in possession of all the necessary facilities that will make us happy and loving towards one another. All the struggles that we see around us come from this ignorance. Zen, therefore, wants us to open a third eye, as Buddhists call it, to the hitherto undreamed of region shut away from us through our own ignorance. When the cloud of ignorance disappears, the infinity of the heavens is manifested, where we see for the first time into the nature of our own being. Cage really understands right from the beginning that, unlike the Indian mysticism that he's been studying, Zen is based on practice and observation rather than on belief or faith, and can free him from his inner turmoil within the context of everyday life. The difference between the two can be found in the example of the Zen or the Hindu monks in Italy, the Hindu monks in India who beg on the streets and go from door to door to get food and sustenance, contrasted with Zen monks who live in monasteries and have gardens which they work themselves and cook for themselves, which means that Zen is for them not an attempt to reach a nirvana that is far away, but to find enlightenment within everyday life. So Cage endeavors to empty his mind, empty it of all judgment, of all personal taste, of likes and dislikes, of everything that is self-expression or what he calls inspiration, all of his emotions. I'd like to read a short quote from him. This is the turning point in his life. This is Cage writing, and Cage talking in an interview some years later. Emotions, like all tastes and memory, are too closely linked to the self, to the ego. The emotions show that we are touched within ourselves, and tastes evidence our way of being touched on the outside. We have made the ego into a wall, and the wall doesn't even have a door through which the interior and exterior could communicate. Suzuki taught me to destroy that wall. What is important is to insert the individual into the current, the flux of everything that happens. And to do that, the wall has to be demolished. Tastes, memory, and emotions have to be weakened. All the ramparts have to be raised. You can feel an emotion. You can feel an emotion. Just don't think that it's so important. And if we keep emotions and reinforce them, they can produce a critical situation in the world. Precisely that situation in which all of society is now entrapped. This is something completely new for him. This is a dramatic change. As Zen denies the self as being separate from the universe, Cage seeks to completely free his music from his self, from his ego, and make it not separate from, but a part of reality. Not a something like a Beethoven symphony to be observed, but separate from experience. Rather, something out of the frame, part of everyday life. This is what a lot of painters were trying to do with the Hawaiian. This is why we talked about out of the frame, getting art out of the frame and into the real world. This is also something that Duchamp talked about a lot. So after the European purpose of music, which was to communicate, and the Indian purpose of music, which was to open oneself to divine influences, comes a new purpose of music, to reveal the flow of life. There are two important concepts that help lead the way musically. First, Cage starts making he recognizes certain things about silence, the nature of silence, the importance of it, and the purpose of it. Suzuki says that silence sees into where there is no something in quotation marks. Cage realizes that silence is not really silence. There's no such thing as silence, but silence is the momentary condition of the universe around us. Later, he will visit a temple in Kyoto in Japan and will meditate with the monks at 4 o'clock in the morning. When the sun comes up a few hours later, one of the monks will throw the doors to the monastery open, and all the sounds of Kyoto will rush into the monastery. And this is how silence pulls us into real life and opens what we're doing, our Zen practice or making music, into real life. He realizes that there's really no silence at all when he visits an anechoic chamber in 1951. He goes to Harvard University, where they have 2 anechoic chambers. An anechoic chamber is a room which has been so upholstered and so built that there is no sound in it whatsoever. There's no echo. It absorbs any kind of sound that's made. So it's the closest thing to absolute silence that you can find on this earth. Cage walks into it, sits down, the door is shut, and he immediately realizes that he's hearing two sounds. He's hearing a high buzzing and a low rumbling. And he rushes out of the anechoic chamber and asks the engineers. He said, I thought this was going to be perfectly quiet. And they said, well, the high sound that you hear is the sound of your nervous system functioning, the synapses. And the low sound that you hear is the sound of your blood in your circulation system. This is an eye-opener for Cage. And this changes the importance of silence in his music. The silence in his music become a little bit like the open spaces in Cy Twombling's painting, where between the events of the painting, there's an open space which lets the world around the painting into the painting. The same thing he does with silence. The next thing that he discovers is the importance of indeterminacy and chance operations. Someone gives him the I Ching as a gift. The I Ching is an ancient book of Chinese wisdom, which is divided up into 64 concepts. Each concept is given a hexagram to symbolize it. And with each hexagram, the concept is listed, and as well there's a philosophical interpretation. And the I Ching can be used as an oracle, either by casting yarrow stalks or casting coins, to ask the I Ching questions. You have to ask it questions, and it's different from other oracles in human experience, because it not only gives you an answer, yes or no, but tells you what you need to do to continue your life or to continue in existence. And Cage immediately recognizes this as a path from making choices in composition, deciding, well, this note's going to come after this note, and then that note is going to come after that note, and that's going to be a loud note, and that's going to be a soft note. From doing that, he moves on to asking questions. What's going to be the next note? How loud is it going to be? How soft is it going to be? How long is it going to be? And he has to deal with the concept of acceptance. When he asks the I Ching a question, he has to accept the answers. But this is wonderful because accepting the answers can mean self-alteration rather than self-expression. If he doesn't agree with the answer that the I Ching gives him, if his instincts tell him that he'd rather use a different note or a different volume, then he has to learn to put his own taste aside and change himself to fit the decision that the I Ching has made. This in his private life as well. This makes it possible for the music to be part of the universe and not just a product of his ego. Indeterminacy, using the I Ching, or later he uses the flaws in the paper that he composes on as help, or star charts, or even later in his life he uses computer programs. But this principle of indeterminacy represents the most radical of Cage's ideas. He is reinventing music or sound or noise or silence to no longer be a product of a composer's inner emotional and intellectual life. by freeing the sounds from any meaning or expression, he allows them to just be, and therefore be a part of the fabric of existence. He asks the question, why should anyone imagine that sounds are not interesting in themselves? His joy is in appreciating sound just as sound by and of itself, whether it's a pitch or noise. A sound, he says, a sound has no history. It has no future. It has no profound meaning. It has no relationship to another sound. A sound is neither ugly or beautiful. Now, Don has found a wonderful short video of Cage talking about this, and I think we should watch it now.
Okay. Share my screen. There we go.
When I hear what we call music, it seems to me that someone is talking, and talking about his feelings or about his ideas of relationships. But when I hear traffic, the sound of traffic here on 6th Avenue, for instance, I don't have the feeling that anyone is talking. I have the feeling that sound is acting. And I love the activity of sound. What it does is it gets louder and quieter, and it gets higher and lower, and it gets longer and shorter. It does all those things which I'm completely satisfied with that. I don't need sound to talk to me. We don't see much difference between time and space. We don't know where one begins and the other stops. So that most of the arts we think of as being in time, and most of the arts we think of as being in space. Marcel Duchamp, for instance, began thinking of thinking of music as being not a time art, but a space art. And he made it a piece called Sculpture Musicale, which means different sounds coming from different places and lasting, producing a sculpture which is sonorous and which remains. People expect listening to be more than listening. And so sometimes they speak of inner listening, or the meaning.
Repair Clinic makes.
Okay.
I don't know what happened there.
Well, it's just a commercial. Let it go.
All right.
Fixing things easy with millions of replacements.
Meaning of sound. When I talk about music, it finally comes to people's minds that I'm talking about sound that doesn't mean anything, that is not inner, but is just outer. And they say, these people who understand that finally say, you mean it's just sounds? Thinking that for something to just be a sound is to be useless. Whereas I love sounds just as they are. And I have no need for them to be anything more than what they are. I don't want them to be psychological. I don't want a sound to pretend that it's a bucket, or that it's a president, or that it's in love with another sound. I just want it to be a sound. And I'm not so stupid either. There was a German philosopher who's very well known, Immanuel Kant, and he said there are two things that don't have to mean anything. One is music, and the other is laughter. Don't have to mean anything, that is, in order to give us very deep pleasure. Oh, you know that, don't you? The sound experience, which I prefer to all others, is the experience of silence. And the silence almost everywhere in the world now is traffic. If you listen to Beethoven or to Mozart, you see that they're always the same. But if you listen to traffic, you see it's always different.
Okay. There we go.
That's a very important point that he makes at the end. Beethoven and Mozart are always the same, but traffic is always something new. And that's a very Buddhist and Oriental principle, Far East principle. The only constant in the universe is change. The only thing that never changes is change itself. He also realized that it was a waste of time. There was no need for him to search for his Buddha nature or for the Buddha nature of a sound, because they are both there already. All we have to do is clear our minds of our ego and get out of the way. I would now like to turn to the first important piece he wrote after making all of these realizations. The Music of Changes, he wrote in 1951, is written for a normal piano. It's not written for a prepared piano. But he developed a very complex system of using the I Ching, using the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching to decide on pitches, the nature of the pitches, if they were high or low, if they were loud or soft, if they were short or long, and the nature of the silences in between. The I Ching decided all of these things so that all of these elements, all of these parameters of the music were taken out of his hands as he felt about it. I think that you'll find when you listen to this, first of all, you have to listen to it in a different way than you listen to Western music. Don was talking about it a little bit at the beginning. It's a kind of meditation. And it's also important that you feel that the silences are woven into our existence and not just something that separates two sonic events, not just something that is placed between two noises. But you have to leave all of your taste, your likes and dislikes, and above all, for us, which is really difficult, all of our expectations. We have to leave our expectations about what music is or what music can be. We have to put that all aside and just listen to the sounds. Please, let's listen to a good piece of this. This is the 5 minutes of it. Okay, that was the end of book 1. Yeah, I thought it was longer than that. First responses. How is this different from what we've heard up till now? One of his first, probably his first piece written with the help of the I Ching.
Tone clusters.
There are some clusters in it, yes.
Yeah.
But
It's
this is
hard to, it's
as
hard to
far-
hear the organization in the piece.
because there is none.
Right.
There's none in the traditional
I would
sense.
explain it.
Yeah. Cage would say, I'm not interested in organization. I'm interested in sound. The organization took place when he divided up the parameters of music over the I Ching. That's the only organization that took place. Everything else is what they call aleatory. It's happened by chance, and it was produced by chance processes. He asked the I Ching using 3 coins. He asked the I Ching all of the questions. All he did was ask questions. The I Ching provided the answer. But you can hear that the music is of a completely open and free impression compared with all of the music that we've listened to up to now, which was all organized in his head first.
Yeah, for me, it's really hard to let go of that sense of waiting for sense to be created, waiting for that organization to show itself. And
That's right. Of course.
That really occurs in the silences where it's okay, I'm waiting. There's a sense of pushing through the silence to get to some next event, and so I was really watching that happen with myself as I was listening, and trying to get where John Cage is, and yeah.
Well,
isn't learning to be present in the silence and to just be part of the silence for as long as it lasts part of the point?
Yeah, totally, I think.
Exactly. And hearing what happens in the silence. We've already discovered that there's no such thing as real complete silence. So in every silence, something happens. Either your cat walks through the room, or the neighbor starts banging a hammer upstairs or something, or there's a bus runs by your apartment. But something happens, even if it's just your own breathing. And one has to be open to that. And when the silences come, we have to learn to not expect anything to happen. Just let it happen when it happens.
I also find that when there is sound in this piece, when you've got these tone clusters, part of what his goal is in writing this was to let go of his own sense of aesthetics, his own taste, but I feel that the audience has to do that as well, let go of their own sense of expectation, because we do expect music to make sense. We do expect structure. I mean, hundreds of years of classical music have prepared us for that. And so he's not only releasing himself from these expectations, but he's also forcing the audience to either sit there frustrated or to release themselves from these centuries of expectation.
That's exactly correct. And it's interesting, when he started writing like this, there would be all kinds of reactions in the audiences when the music was performed. Some people would start to whistle and shout, other people would get upset and walk out of the room. And he was asked about how he felt about that. And he said, well, he says, if that's what the music is for them at that moment, in that part of their mindfulness, then that's what the music is. That's what it is in that moment for them. That doesn't mean it has to be that for everybody. And it doesn't mean that it has to be that for anyone all the time. It changes all the time. My suggestion is that you listen to this piece or a part of it for 5 minutes every day or every other day at a different time of the day, whenever you have 5 minutes to sit down and listen to it, and see how it fits in with the environment around you and about the life around you. Just like Don was talking about at the beginning when you were doing your practice. Zen is not faith or belief, it is practice and observation. And what Cage wants is that we practice and observe his music and not have a belief in it. That's something else. Or not expect to have any kind of communication in it. It just is what it is. Let's look at two other pieces that he wrote around the same time that are completely different, but will show you the extent to which his mind moved around. He was really the most remarkable inventor. Schoenberg later said, he said he was the most talented pupil I ever had, not as a composer, but as an inventor. He was an amazing inventor. About the same time that he was working on this piano piece, he was working on a piece called Imaginary Landscape No. 4. We won't talk about 1 through 3, they were earlier, but Imaginary Landscape No. 4 is a piece written for 12 radios and 24 players. Each radio has 2 players. One player controls the volume, and the other player controls which station is being listened to. And here he frees himself from pitch completely. The piece is organized according to the I Ching. There's a score, and the score tells the players when to change the volume, when to change the station. But the unpredictability is even higher than with the piano piece because of the radio broadcasts. If you go down the dial, if you turn the dial on your radio, you never know what the radio station you run into is going to be sending. You don't know what it's going to be, or if you're going to land on static, on white noise. Let's listen to a bit of that.
À titre de ministre.
I'm asking you to make a donation before the September FEC deadline so that we can flip the
Increase. But
The Commerce Department reports that during the first quarter, the gross domestic product rose at a far from
numbers. Competitive models and the level of equipment may vary. Does not look like an all-day rain outside.
and probably into June as well. Hopefully that will really help stimulate.
370 UN peacekeepers hostage. Back home, so hold on.
Okay, fantastic. Cage would have been completely delighted with the political commercial that came in the middle. He would have been very happy about that. The thing is, there's only one. It's just a shame when you hear the piece live, the 12 radios are spread across the stage so that there's a distance between them, and that heightens the effect, of course. Any first reactions? This is different from what we've been.
To me, this is about the constancy of change, you know, both within the piece itself, but also from performance to performance. I mean, this is a piece that you could perform it 20 times and it's going to be completely different. And people say the same thing about Beethoven, you know, oh, we're performing Beethoven with the orchestra again, but, you know, every performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is different. Well, yes, that's true, but not like this. You know, John Cage takes it to a completely different level.
I think he's crossed the line here. I think he's moved from lack of organization into deliberate disorganization. And I'm not sure what his purpose is.
Well, yes, what is his purpose? That's the big question. I'll go back to something that he said before, that the new purpose of music is to reveal the flow of life. Now, there's a Zen concept, if there ever has been one. It's not to communicate, but to help us understand how the universe works and how life, our existence, functions. Let's go to another piece, one more piece, called Williams Mix, that he was working on at the same time. He began working, this is another direction he went into. He began working with pieces of magnetic tape. Magnetic tape recorders started to be very popular around this time. And he asked friends all over the world to send him recordings of sounds from wherever they were. So he had sounds from Singapore and from Japan and from Australia and from South America, all put onto tape. And he cut down all of these pieces according to the I Ching. The I Ching decided how long each sound would be, each piece of tape. In those days, you had to do everything by splicing. There were no computers. So he sat together with some friends in front of a splicing machine and just spliced all of these sounds together, put them one next to each other, according to a graphic score that he had written with the help of the I Ching. And the basic material, this was in 1951, this was a very difficult and time-consuming task. The basic material was his beloved everyday noise. Let's have a couple of minutes of this. Okay, I want to follow that with a quote from Cage from his book Silence. Think about the last three pieces we've listened to when I read this. So that listening, one takes as a springboard the first sound that comes along. The first something springs us into nothing, and out of that nothing arises the next something, etc., like an alternating current. Not one sound fears the silence that extinguishes it. But if you avoid it, that's a pity, because it resembles life very closely. And life and it are essentially a cause for joy. People say sometimes, timidly. He once said, if we try to ignore noise, it irritates us. But if we listen to it, it begins to become interesting. Any comments?
It sounds like Hegelian philosophy, thesis, antithesis, and it makes me realize that silence can be a refuge.
A refuge or a door?
Yeah.
That opens. Yeah, absolutely. Before saying goodbye, there's one more piece that we should consider. And I wanted to somehow set up a performance of it, but that's not going to be possible because of the technical situation that we're in. Someday I would like to come to Westchester and perform this piece. It's the most famous piece that he wrote. It's called 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And it's written for any instrument, any number of players. It's a piece that has 3 movements, and all 3 movements are silent. The score is such that he times the silence of each movement. And the performer, the first performer was David Tudor, who played the piano pieces that we heard. The performer takes a stopwatch and opens the piano keyboard and sits there and listens for 33 seconds and then closes the keyboard. That's the end of the first movement. And then the second movement, he does the same thing, and the same thing for the third movement. But there's no sound. He doesn't play anything in that sense. And this is forcing the audience to be aware of what's around them and what's in them and what's in between them. The idea for this piece started with a painter named Rauschenberg, who painted some completely white canvases. Now, these white canvases were really fascinating to Cage because depending on what kind of dust fell on them or what kind of shadow fell on them, they reflected life, the life around them. And for him, this piece that he wrote was the complete and perfect inner penetration between art and life. This is what he'd been seeking his whole life long from the very, very beginning. It's, as Kay Larson says, who wrote this wonderful book about him, it's a kind of expansion of Zazen. Beginning Zazen, you sit with your legs crossed and you think about yourself, you concentrate on your own body and your own breathing. And then you move out of yourself slowly but surely, and you learn to practice Zazen in your daily life eventually, so that you're, so to say, you're constantly practicing Zazen. And that is what this piece is about. He says, I have nothing to say, and I am saying it. And that is poetry as I need it. Here's another quote, 276. Oh, yes. He talks about this piece many years later after he wrote it. Well, I use it constantly in my life experience. No day goes by without my making use of that piece in my life and in my work. I listen to it every day. I don't sit down to do it. I turn my attention toward it. I realize that it's going on continuously. So more and more, my attention as now is on it. More than anything else, it's the source of my enjoyment of life. But the important thing, surely, about having done it, finally, is that it leads out of the world of art into the whole of life. When I write a piece, I try to write it in such a way that it won't interrupt this other piece, which is already going on. And that is expanded Zazen. Any questions? We're almost out of time. Donald is smiling. I'm glad.
Comments from anyone? I mean, we unfortunately had our little technological glitch up front and lost some time. So if you have a question that you're not asking because you're afraid we're going to go past 12, I suspect that we could talk Gary into going an extra couple of minutes.
It's only 6 o'clock in the evening here, so I have.
Yeah, okay.
I'm not going to bed yet.
Can I just make a comment? I just want to thank Gary for this. Gary's a colleague of mine. I'm a singer and he's one of my pianists. And I just want to say that this lecture has really helped me to them when I'm listening to contemporary music. I performed an awful lot of it. And to free my mind to be more open to the message rather than always searching for something that is more relatable. to my own personal experience. And that's the reason I wanted to follow this lecture, because I've always been fascinated by Cage's music. And I hope that exactly that sort of Zen, understanding the connection between that and the sort of Zen way of viewing the world, or not viewing the world, or taking it on and is in the moment. And I especially think now with what the world is right now, being in the moment is so important. And it's exactly what I hope to get out of this lecture. And thank you very much, Gary.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Gary. I don't know enough to ask an intelligent question, but I am so grateful for what you have given me today. I have a grandson who's a composer and a gardener, and is very much into Zen Buddhism. And his parents are a little freaked out by that. But this lecture of yours has been very comforting, and gives me some doors to open to talk with my grandson in a positive and affirming way, and to reassure my daughter and son-in-law that he's not falling off a cliff. And I'm getting some books out of the library, so I'm going to learn more. So thank you.
If I may, I wanted to thank you for saying that. That's really, that makes me very happy to hear that. I want to recommend a book, or two books actually, to anyone who's interested not only in John Cage, but in Buddhism, or in how artists function inside. There's an amazing book written by a woman named Kay Larson, Larson, with the title, Where the Heart Beats, John Cage, Zen Buddhism, and the Inner Life of Artists. And I don't mind saying that it was one of the major sources for this little talk. She goes into the whole thing much, much deeper than I could, and explains it all in a much more elegant and poetic way than I can. I recommend this book heartily. It's just a plain good read. It's fun to read the book.
Yeah, it's terrific.
The other book I recommend is, of course, Cage's own book called Silence, which has just come out in the 50th anniversary edition. Some of it is a little technical, some of it is for non-musicians a little difficult, but there are other places, there are many, many essays in it that are interesting for people who are practicing Zen Buddhists or interested in contemporary music and modern music and in modern art. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to get to it, but Cage had an enormous amount of influence on painters and theater people and writers, especially in the second half of his life. I mean, we have to consider that after he started writing with Indeterminacy and wrote the pieces that we've been talking about, he lived for another 40 years. And so he did a lot of things. He spent about 10 years of his life not composing at all, but doing theater. He helped invent the Fluxus movement, and he had an enormous amount of influence on visual and theater artists. Other composers as well. Morton Feldman. If you want to hear what kind of influence or what Cage's influence could mean to a composer who was not a Zen Buddhism, who was not interested that much in Oriental thought, but who was interested in Cage's ideas, seek out the music of Morton Feldman. There are pieces on YouTube. I would recommend Rothko Chapel is one, and another one is called Coptic Lights. Both of these pieces are good examples of really fantastic pieces that have been written by people who have come under Cage's influence. Artists like Robert Rauschenberg, and Jasper Johns have also been greatly influenced by him. Oh, and of course, all of you should go to the museum in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and visit the Duchamp room. There's a whole room of Duchamp's works there, including the Buddha of the bathroom.
Thank you very much. I found it very good. My son is an artist, and the connection of the art and the music, and he's been finding art, during this COVID time very therapeutic. And I myself play the piano, and I haven't been playing it. So you reminded me I need to get back on the keyboard.
Or not get back on the keyboard, depending on how you look at it.
Yeah, I liked your comment on laughing too. That was good.
Oh, the Cage's comment on laughing.
Yeah.
Yeah, Cage's comment on that. Well, it's very funny because all of the people who knew him said that after he discovered Zen Buddhism at the end of the 40s and the beginning of the 50s, his whole nature as a person changed. After that, they said he went through life smiling and laughing and was terribly interested in other people and was always friendly and open, whereas before he'd been much, much more for himself.
Thank you.
There you go. Thank you all for listening so patiently and having so much patience with me. This is not what I usually do. This is something outside of my my normal experience. So I apologize for any places where I sort of drone on and got boring or was not clear in saying what I wanted to say. But I thank you all very, very much.
No, it was quite wonderful.
Thank you, Gary. Bravo.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gary. You do well in the teaching mode. Thank you.
That was great.
Bye-bye.
And so y'all can remember October 24th, the next semester, the next seminar. So come on by again. You'll probably get an invitation of some kind to that. So, and thank you all for attending.
Thanks, Don, for making it possible.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Don.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.